Well, welcome to the second international question time that we've conducted at World Architecture Festival Virtual this week. We had an intriguing session yesterday with speakers from Seattle and Los Angeles and Copenhagen. We've got an even more diverse group with us today. And so welcome Maria Warner-Wong of Warner-Wong Design and Wow Architects, Patrick Bellew, Founding Director of Atelier 10, Christoph Ingenhoven of Ingenhoven Architects, Joe Noero of Noero Architects, Simon Allford, Founding Director at Allford Hall Monaghan Morris and President-elect of the Royal Institute of British Architects, Allison Brooks, Principal and Creative Director at Allison Brooks Architects, and joining us at some point, Benedetta Tagliabue, co-founder and CEO of Miralles Tagliabue, EMBT, Barcelona, as I'm sure you know, and of course my WAF colleague, Jeremy Melvin. I'm going to chair this conversation and discussion. And I'd like to kick off by asking you each in turn how you have been dealing personally with this very strange year where you've been working from, and what impact it's had on your organization or your practice in terms of the way you're working. So why don't we kick off with Patrick Bellew.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, Paul, Jeremy. Nice to see you all, Maria. It's been an interesting year. I mean, we're lucky in some ways in terms of practicing this because we've got offices from all over the place, from San Francisco to Singapore to Sydney, and so we've been quite used to working and doing design work online and using Zoom and other these tools for running the business. So running the business hasn't been too hard. Running the projects has been slightly more difficult, I think. I think they really missed the creative time sat around the table, enabled us to chat and exchange views. The kind of staccato nature of Zooming makes design, I think, a much longer and harder process to work at. So, but we have largely stayed out of the studio. We've been doing most things online, all the analysis work and feedback work and design work with our architect friends and colleagues. I'm an engineer, by the way. With Atelier 10 rather than an architect, and so we've found it's been okay. We've run projects with some of the people here on the call over the year and really not had too many stumbles along the way. I think one just misses that creative process, and I particularly miss the bouncing off people at events like WAF, where you get to meet large numbers of people sort of through osmosis. That really missed that this year, that kind of engagement and the industry working together as a kind of brought together in the way that WAF does is so effective.
I think, Patrick, you should mention your happy recent announcement, because you concluded an important step in the life of your office just recently, despite lockdowns and all the rest of it.
Yeah, we've had a conversation going on with a group called Sabana Jurong in Singapore for the last 18 months or so, and we concluded the negotiations for us to merge and become part of their very large group, international group, just a few weeks ago. It's great for us in that it gives us an enormous access to markets in Asia and beyond in a way that we couldn't really do as a relatively small private enterprise of 300 or so people. So we've got that deal has just closed recently, and yes, I'm working very happily in Singapore and all over Asia already, talking about opportunities there, and in Australia and Canada with the group in Sabana Jurong. So thank you for mentioning that, Paul. I was resisting doing the commercial, but yeah, it's been really good.
No, it's interesting that such an important negotiation can be conducted and concluded in the rather difficult circumstances we've been experiencing. I'm going to ask Christoph Ingenhoven to tell us how things have been for you in Germany, pretty well managed, I think, by government. But how's it affecting the practice and architects there?
Hello. It was difficult, I have to say, to adapt to that. We directly went into lockdown. We directly put 50% of the people in home office in Singapore and in Germany. And for, I would say, like the period until April, we stayed in home office in alteration. Then we realized that the people don't want to stay any longer in home office because most of our staff is young, single. They are international. They're coming to Düsseldorf or Singapore to work, and they want to be with people, right? And so they get like lonesome. So they went back to the office. We rented more space. We widened the workplaces so we could manage according to the regulations. And it's still the same. I think then they are all in the office. Maybe they are 2 or 3% or 5% in home office, but that's the exemption from the rule. Everybody is working. Nobody got Corona or COVID. Nobody. No family member. No staff. So it went quite well at the end, technically spoken, medically spoken. I have to say the discussion about what home office is about and if it is helpful. I mean, we seem to be all in home office more or less, right? I mean, if I look around where all the people sit is more or less at home or somewhere. So we were all like used to do that over our traveling policy that we had, right? The way we worked and lived the last 20 years was a little bit like that as head of office or like people who are responsible. But for the staff, it's a very difficult situation, I think. And to do, from my point of view, nearly impossible to remotely. You have to be together with the people. And we did a lot of effort to bring the people together safely and have a little bit of a minimum of working together on the table. But we had as well like projects in Melbourne and Sydney and wherever, Tokyo and so on. And we had to do that online. And it was somehow possible. My impression is every work relation that is established, every project team that is established is pretty well. To do acquisition, it's very difficult. Yeah, to get to know new people, very difficult. Yeah, so we tried to travel as much as it was possible. They're closing down now. In Europe, you could travel like Great Britain, Switzerland, Austria, and so on. It was quite good, quite possible, especially during the summer. But now they're closing down everything. I mean, even Switzerland, Austria, Germany are not open anymore. So they are putting it all again to a real lockdown. So we have to look what is coming out. Our success, I mean, economically, it was a successful year, I have to say. Surprisingly, I always think the crisis in architecture is coming later with postponement. Yeah? So it's next year that might be very difficult economically.
Yes, that's an ominous thought. I'm going to come to London now and invite Allison Brooks to tell us what's your experience, Allison, both of kind of workload and the working life of the practice.
Well, I feel really fortunate, a little bit similar to Christoph, that we've had a very good year. It became very busy in about June, which was amazing. I mean, we already had quite a lot of work and teams working sort of flat out doing huge construction document packages, and actually the type of work where actually being remote and working on teams was very effective in enabling teams to communicate with each other sort of fluidly, more fluidly than they had found it actually being in the office, which is very interesting. It's amazing how even in, one office with big space, you can not actually interact with people in your own office. And I think that's been a very interesting sort of phenomenon. Also, the fact that, as a principal or a practice leader in project team meetings, you're face to face with everybody on the team, from the new graduate to the to the associate. And so I think that's been very interesting that in a way, younger people in the practice have had more face time and more contact with more senior people in the practice and clients and, the GLA and the LLDC, a lot of face to face. And I think to a certain extent, we've all found this kind of exhausting, like too much FaceTime with colleagues and clients. But in a way, I think it's been very good for younger people and practices. I think also it's been a good time for people who are engaged in professions that take a lot of planning. It's been just a very good time to plan. We've not all been rushing around traveling, as well as clients thinking, this is a good time to get started on a project or to take a project forward, because everybody's a little bit more reflective in terms of how they're operating on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis. We've all had a bit more time to just, get to grips with things that need thought and planning. So we've been very fortunate. We've had new inquiries. There have been competitions, and but I also agree that people have really missed the convening in the office and the ability to have those off the cuff and serendipitous conversations that are interesting and enlightening. They don't even have to be architectural. It's just what you did at the weekend, or a book you're reading, or a radio show, or just little inputs that add to a kind of thinking, conversational culture that's creative somehow. And so we've been coming back into the office, half the office Monday, Tuesday, half the office Thursday, Friday, bit of flexibility in between, and very, very important for new members of staff, for sure.
Well, yes, and it's rather difficult to have spontaneous conversations if it requires you to book a Zoom meeting in advance. It's a bit like sort of compulsory fun or brainstorming for 1 hour exactly, not a minute more and not a minute less. I'm going to turn to Joe Noero. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say it's also really hard to get them to end, but you must be very good at that by now, getting like Zoom conversations to finish.
Well, yes, we have to, and we've got a time clicker on our screen, which is a wonderful discipline. Joe Noero, how are things in South Africa, and are the sort of trends you've seen in response to the pandemic, are they continuations of things that were happening anyway, or is it a kind of brand new condition to deal with?
Well, Paul, I run a small practice, and there's 7 of us, and we're like a family. So working from home hasn't been a problem because we're in regular contact every day. We happen to be lucky that we live in probably the most beautiful city in the world. And we all live in beautiful parts of the city. So to be at home for me is a real pleasure. I mean, Joy and I get up in the morning and we take the dogs for a walk on the beach, which is 2 minutes away from our house. And that's how we start our day. So we've been in so-called lockdown since March. We haven't been back to the office. But South Africa's a bit of a mess at the moment because we have a very poor economy, which was present before the lockdown, we have politics, economics, and health all collapsing into each other, and it's not been a pleasant period. It hasn't been a pleasant period. I mean, our economy is on its knees. We've achieved junk status. There's very little work. What work there is not very nice. And so we're all just hoping and praying that the vaccine, we'll be able to get the vaccine in Africa rather than it go to the rich countries, which looks like
Sorry, we just lost Joe there for a bit, so I'm going to move on and invite Maria Warner Wong to tell us We've heard a bit about Singapore already, but how are things for WOW architects?
Well, things have been interesting here because we're in a country where, as you know, it's a country where there's a high degree of control. So pretty much everything is under control, including COVID. So we're very fortunate to have had a very low incidence, a relatively low incidence of COVID and very, very few deaths. And things have been kind of relatively peaceful and calm. We are almost carrying on in a normal manner in most aspects or many aspects of life, except for in the world of work, where we still aren't entirely permitted to have complete return to work in the office. And in the meantime, a whole lifestyle movement around working from home has transformed many of the architects on our team into true believers. And they're very, very happy to have a home-based working lifestyle that enables them to do their work, to have a balanced life, to take time for leisure and personal well-being and other aspects of life that commuting kind of takes away. So we're really re-looking at how we work. And we're looking into also how we're going to work with clients, because it's a complete change. But what I find very exciting is that we're now starting to have virtual interactions with people that we wouldn't have had interactions with unless we were prepared to travel in the past. And as you know, Singapore is far from where most of our work and most of our clients are. And now we find that travel is no longer a barrier to communication and connection. So I think that beyond COVID, there's going to be some good coming out of the technology that has kind of taken over our way of working. And but for the meantime, our office is quite quiet. Our work is proceeding. The construction is ongoing, albeit we do expect there to be some setbacks. And it's mostly our clients in many, many countries in the region and beyond who are in more uncertain situations and sort of waiting to see when it's safe to proceed with projects.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to invite Benedetta, welcome, to say a few words about how your office has been working and how is Barcelona?
Hello, Paul, and hello, everybody. Barcelona is fantastic as usual, but it's sad. It's in a sad moment, really. Everything closed and so little people around. And I think this pandemic is so long that it had many different phases. So at the beginning, everybody was surprised and scared, and we ran home in one day like refugees, expecting the worst. And it was incredible how fast we could organize ourselves. Let's say we just connected our computers so that everybody who wanted to work from home just was using their own computer. So it was incredible for the people who were going in the office. One of two of us were going sometimes. The computers were working by themselves. We were an office of ghosts. It was absolutely an incredible image. And we were very connected. We were trying our best. But after 3 months, you realize that really something is missing. You can go on, access to every information, be in contact, blah, blah, blah. But we are creative people. And I realize more than in any other moment that we are an industry. We are a creative industry. So we need to be open. We need to be together. And with this decision from May, June on, we started to go back to the office, which is very open, very big. We have external space. We always have the open windows. And we were so lucky to be able to do that until now, and because the weather is fantastic. And we make a very together life in the open space. And we are back to work in this creative way. Then you discover a lot of nice things. For example, I was traveling to China very often, and I was traveling too often. I was tired, and now it's like having a real holiday. I don't have to travel anymore. It's fantastic. Very egoistically, I think it's fantastic. And now with China, it's incredible. China is booming. I don't know, 2 days ago, we had a kind of a presentation for a competition. And when the Zoom made us in the room appeared to us, and there was, as usual, this enormous big table with something like 70, 80 people around. I think nobody had mask, and it seemed, life is coming back, and a lot of things are happening. So the world is very different, but now we are learning that something's possible to do with this fantastic technology. Something else is better to do live. So I propose the mix.
Thank you very much, Benedetta. And yes, definitely live events are happening in China. The inaugural World Architecture Festival China event took place, which was an awards presentation ceremony, and it took place on Tuesday of this week in Chengdu, with about 250 people there, many of whom had won awards, which were judged remotely by international juries that we helped our Chinese partners to select. We had a super jury and picked 6 marvelous projects that were presented with trophies out in Chengdu, and they seem to have things under control. I hesitate to say even more than Singapore, but certainly life looks to be pretty normal there. Well, perhaps I can come to Simon Allford in London. Simon, how's it been for AHMM, and what's the office like?
Hi, I've just come from a visit to a stone factory to choose some stone for a project, which reminded me of all the problems of being on Zoom and Teams. So like everyone, we've managed it and it's been fine, and the world slowed down and there was a bit of a break, and that was quite good. And we found a number of things. Like Christoph, we found that no one we really know or deal with has been affected by the illness. So in that sense, there hasn't been any kind of personal impact. We found interesting things. We found the young were mobile but disconnected from broadband, and they had no space. We found the older ones of us had space and broadband, but we were less able. Like Patrick, we've trialed it with international offices. We've trialed it with colleagues who've left and work on their own in another country who we've kept on employing. So we were quite well set up. So for 3 months, it was fine. Since then, I personally have been back in the office since June. I like talking to people. I like meeting them face to face. I like drawing on drawings. I like drawing on the wall. I like kind of the conversation. I like the stimulation. I don't like sitting with a headphone here in this office of mine that's very nice. I like the bigger office. And we've got about 10-15% of our staff coming back. I hope more will come back. So, I think it's been a real challenge, and I think it's accelerated good things. The shock means we're not traveling. The shock means we're thinking more about carbon and these kinds of things, and the world around us, embodied and operational. So I think the shock has been kind of, in an optimistic way, you take it on. You do what Joe did. You go walking on the beach, which I can't do in London, but it's kind of energized people. But we definitely found after about 3 or 4 months, we needed to get people back in a room, and now people are coming in for a day or two. And I think in the post-COVID, in the vaccine world, there's a lot of good stuff we'll take in there. There'll be lots of junior members of staff will be able to listen to meetings they previously couldn't attend. But if you're not in the office and you're not meeting people and you're not listening to their conversations, if you're not bouncing ideas off them, I think you lose the whole benefit of being in a city, in a place, and a culture. So our joke is the office is dead, long live the office. But I think the good things we're interested in, which is that idea about coming together creatively, to be industrious, to generate ideas, we need to convene physically, but maybe less often, and we can supplement that with these other technologies. So it's going to be exciting. I think it'll reboot. As a business, we're fine. We've shrunk a little bit, but that's all right. We paid out a small profit share. You know, we have enough work. We haven't had to make anyone redundant, but that isn't what everyone's experienced. I know some people have found it really tough.
Thank you very much. I'm going to see if we can get back to Joe at this point. Joe, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Sorry about that. It's just to explain to the international listeners is that we've had a very serious bout of corruption in our state-owned enterprises, which means that we have an irregular power supply in South Africa. And that means that every now and then things just go blank. So my apologies, but blame it on the government. But what I was going to say
no
is
problem.
that, yeah,
I just wanted to pick up
it's a
where
bit
we
like
were
your
sort of leave.
It's a bit like your 3-day working week in 1973, Paul, except we can never predict when it's going to hit us, you know. But just to say that we're all coping here, and I think now's the time in South Africa for a bit of courage and imagination, and we have to just stand fast, and hopefully we'll get through this period. But it's not pleasant, and I'm afraid I don't want to put a gloss on it. It's pretty unpleasant, and we just live from day to day and hope that things will get better. We're about to hit a second phase of our of the a second peak of the pandemic, and our medical facilities are really overstretched. We unlike more developed countries, if we get a large number of people who are very ill, we just don't have the space, nor do we have the equipment really to look after them. So we have to be very careful about wearing masks and social distancing and stuff like that. But we're doing fine anyhow, and it's lovely to hear other people in other parts of the world who are surviving and doing very well. That's good to know. At least the architectural profession is not dying globally. It's just struggling in some parts of the world, but in other parts of the world it seems to be flourishing, which is nice to hear.
Thanks very much for that, Joe. And I'm now going to ask Jeremy Melvin to give us a reflection and perhaps contrast with some of the things that we heard yesterday, or pick up on some of the themes. For example, the way in which the not travelling has allowed more time for thinking.
Well, it's often the case that a downturn in economic activity leads to enormous innovation. I mean, if you the greatest downturn in recent history in the early 1930s actually saw a whole new range, not just of organizations, but also of industries emerging. And in the 1970s, architecture, and I'm thinking here particularly about architecture, underwent an enormous sort of revision and period of innovation. A lot of it, not all of it obviously, but a lot of it coming out of the Architectural Association, then run by Arvin Boyarsky. And many of the people who came through that are still prominent. I mean, Rem Koolhaas, Zaha Hadid may be dead, but her practice certainly lives on. Stephen Hull, who we heard about from Peter Cook. What that did was to allow a period, it's not like, going to sleep or locking yourself away in your back bedroom with a series of books. It's actually a change in mental state, I think.
I want to pick that point up about the potential benefits in terms of thinking about doing the same thing in different ways, or possibly doing different things in new ways. And again, I'll come to each of you in turn to invite you to perhaps speculate about some of the things that will change in your world, not in the way you work. I think we've dealt with the Zoom business, but in the way that the built environment design professionals may be thinking about the buildings that you're creating, the public spaces that you generate, and in fact the way that we design our cities for use and for health and for leisure. and I'm going to start with a non-architect because Patrick, actually environmental engineering in the last, shall we say, 25 years has undergone extraordinary changes and has become significantly more influential in the way we think about the world, largely as a result of climate change. How do you see things moving forward now? And do you think that the effects of the pandemic will really change what was happening, or may it reinforce it?
I'd say that yeah, it's certainly 25 or 30 years of conversations seem to have accelerated in the last 12 months in the UK beyond recognition. I would probably speculate that in Germany and Holland and Scandinavia, potentially these conversations have been going on for longer and in more detail. But I think that we're seeing in the UK, the US, and Australia, in our offices there, we're seeing a massive change in clients' attitudes to it. So it's very much sort of ground up. It's partly coming from our junior staff, flowing through that way, through enthusiasm for climate change issues, and it's really strongly flowing down from our clients. All of our clients are asking us now to, it's almost their first question, how green is my building got to be rentable, sellable, or whatever. It's fundamentally changed in the last 12 months, I think. Simon alluded to it already, that we started to see in the early days of COVID a preoccupation with things like air quality and how might buildings adapt to a sort of a world where pandemics are potentially more of a design driver. And so we've already been looking at nearly all of the buildings, large and small, moving back to kind of mixed mode on natural ventilation, a kick back against fully sealed buildings, rightly or wrongly, but I think probably rightly. And so we're looking at more and more mixed mode kind of types of propositions. But most of all, the conversations around embodied carbon, recognizing that it's the carbon that we emit in making buildings right now is becoming the biggest issue, because with the electrification of the grid and with ever improving energy performance in buildings, the embodied carbon is the biggest game in town, and it fundamentally affects architecture. It fundamentally affects clients. It affects decision making around almost everything in the building process. And it adds another kind of layer of currency. It means that in every project we're starting to take carbon as a cost plan, a carbon plan as well as a cost plan, and running the two things in parallel. And certainly a project we're doing right now with Simon has been positively forensic in that all the different things that we've studied to try and absolutely drive the cost down. It's also been helped by RIBA and Letty releasing some hard targets earlier this year, or end of last year and early this year, in their sustainability guidelines, which have given sort of things for us to shoot at, and things that, and people love a target. The thing about BREEAM and LEED and those targets is they were too broad in some ways. They didn't give us enough, the real nitty gritty detail to shoot at about, is it timber, is it concrete, is it recycled, is the material recycled, is it primed, where does it come from, what blast furnace does it come from? We're starting to see, manufacturers responding by actually having the information you want when you ask them, so that they can be considered, that that. And once the architectural profession starts demanding this information, the supply chain will adjust to supply it in a way that it never previously has. So we're seeing really fundamental shift in the kind of focus absolutely in the last 12 months. And I can't tell you how many calls I've been on in the last 9 months through COVID, through the outbreak, just on the embodied carbon issue. It's great. It's finally coming to focus. We've been tracking it on projects for 20 years, but now there's some real hard, good thinking going on, and the materials market is following along quickly behind and improving, which is what you need.
Now, is the implication of this that we will become increasingly concerned with retrofitting of the existing, and it may become increasingly difficult or looked down on to demolish existing buildings where there's significant embodied carbon involved?
To some extent, that if you've got a building that is can be reused effectively, absolutely. The embodied carbon argument is definitely one of the means by which you choose. I think if a building is fundamentally unfit for purpose or can't be extended, or the floor to ceiling heights aren't enough, there may be sometimes cases for demolition. That's in the case of a regeneration or redevelopment. What we're seeing in New York, they've just released Local Law 97, which established a hard per square foot greenhouse gas emission cap for all buildings. And if they don't achieve those targets, they will be pinged $280 a ton per year for every additional ton of carbon emitted. So there's a deep green retrofit of existing buildings, whether they were going to be renovated or not. The owners are having and do major green upgrades. It's triggered an entire new market in New York, which is spreading out around a little bit on other cities on the East Coast, so Boston, looking at it, so on. So we're starting to see also, we're not seeing it in London yet, but a requirement that existing buildings raise their game, and even when they're not going through a deep retrofit or a whether or not the buildings are being emptied out and redeveloped or not. So that's really where the next game in town is. And I think your question, I think, presupposes that it's a development project of some sort to improve a building. Do you drop it or do you keep it? But I think what's really interesting in the States in addressing this is that they're starting, through local laws, they're starting to drive, in certain states of the States, I should say, it's not everywhere, but they're starting to drive really significant greening of buildings through local laws and are putting fines on people if they don't achieve it. Big fines, if you don't achieve it.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask Christoph Ingenhoven to pick up on this subject, because your practice has always been kind of at the forefront of German architects interested in sustainability and environmental design. And I guess this must be, in a way, a kind of very pleasant time for you, because ideas that you've supported have become mainstream.
Excuse me, I was muted. In a way it is, but I have to say there's a kind of acceleration, right? It's more intensity on that questions. Let me wrap that up in 3 words. I think the world of architecture has to think about avoiding, to build, to spend, whatever, avoiding. Then, if that is not possible, reduction in every meaning of that word. Reduction of energy, resources, material, whatever. Also, CO2 is a kind of spending, right? So it's an amount of carbon that we still have, and that we can still spend as a world community, and that is absolutely limited. And if we go over, it's a real problem. There's not much more time to think about that. It's a time to act, right? And if reduction is not possible, the only other thing that we have to do is compensation if it's not possible. But that's the least good way to deal with the problem, right? That's all I can say. I mean, and if the architectural community would spend more time and more energy in these questions, it would be a much better world. To be honest, I felt the last 30 years a little lonesome sometimes, because there are many people now talking about these issues, the last 10 years, whatever, 15 years. But I think it's still much too small number of people really acting seriously in this respect. Let me raise one more thing, because you asked us also about what Corona, what pandemic things could change in our behavior as architects or city planners and so on. There are many things, but also 2 things. One is, I think instead of waiting for new regulations and certifications, we just should act in the most sensible way. Like, for giving you a very simple example, the number of elevators we have in high rises will be much more and bigger, right? Because otherwise we have no chance to avoid these kind of pandemic things. That's the same with corridors, flexibility of spaces. Do it bigger, do it not smaller, things like that, more generous, and so on. So I think we just should start doing these things. And there's one more political thing that's about public space. I think the value of public space has never been as big or as visible in that pandemic situation. I was spending some months in London during the pandemic. I have to say the way the people used communal gardens and the parks and the width of the city was impressive. And I think that's the best outcome, that we have to preserve real public spaces, not commercially managed, not restricted entrance to, approachable and near to the people in the middle of the community. I think we have to do much more about that.
Thank you very much. Benedetta, your own office is a wonderful example of a historic building being reused. Do you see more of a trend to reuse? And also, picking up on Christoph's other point, do you see the sort of urbanism of Barcelona with its dense environments? Do you see that changing? Do you think we will change our attitude to density and mixing?
Well, in the case of reuse, I think in Spain we are kind of very good, because it's in a way it's a poor country, so we have always done our best to use our the things which values at the maximum. And I love it personally, maybe because I have a kind of a romantic feeling. I always like what arises from history to us. So I hope we will be more conscious about the necessity and the importance of reusing. And I was very happy to listen to Patrick talking about that. And then about the public spaces, I always think this pandemic, which I personally, but it's making things also something positive coming out. For example, there's more consciousness about the need of quality and the need of public space at every scale. Because, for example, when we were inside our home, which was something that we couldn't expect, we suddenly were absolutely happy to have a window with some sun arriving, or a balcony that you could look outside. And then we started to rediscover that the roofs of Barcelona, for example, are like the green space, the open space for the small community of the house. And this can become incredibly valuable in a situation like that. So I think most of the roofs in Barcelona started to be well planted with flowers, because we were all there and looking after what we had. And then in other scales, of course, you value a lot what is the public space of the neighborhood, and then a bigger public space of more general to the city. So I think we became more conscious about the importance of all that. And to introduce something more, we became more conscious also about the beautiful feeling that some natural material inside your house gives. So in a way, it's fantastic, no? That you say, "Oh, I love my house, and I love my some of my furniture, and I love the things I have put there." And natural material became very, very important. Let's say the wood, the presence of wood, ceramic, nice material to keep next to you are very important. And also plants and animals. I think in a way we understand that the inside of our homes have to be more natural. It means more full of life. So I think these were things that we became more conscious about during this pandemic. They were existing before anyway.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Jeremy Melvin to pick up on this point about light access to open air, which has been a bit of a theme this week, with people talking about, the modernity and the way that TB generated hospital designs, and in some ways, the idea of clean air and sunlight and space and access to nature has never really gone away, but it's come back with a vengeance over the past 12 months.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, obviously, an awful lot of the rhetoric around modern architecture in the early part of the 20th century was about health, and that then health meant daylight, ventilation, fresh air. In the case of Alto's Pineo Santorum for sufferers from tuberculosis, it meant breathing in the vapors of pine forests, which was, at this point, there was no real treatment for tuberculosis. And it was only relief that could be offered. And that, I think, it's very interesting how that can come back. Now, some of it can come back through simulation. That in the hospitals that Perkins and Will showed, the idea of having artificial daylight at the nursery station was quite an interesting idea. I'm not sure I really like it, but it's obviously a possibility which shouldn't be ignored or overlooked. So I think that's all coming back. In London, at least, there seems to be a trend in the residential property market away from the dense, relatively recent development. There's been a lot of residential development in London in the last 20 years, much of it around quite large developments of apartments, which may or may not have their own balcony. Most probably do have a balcony, but they don't have great communal space. And there's been a move back to the suburbs, which in a sense would reverse 30 years of what's been happening in London, which is the centre is repopulated. And I think there is a very interesting issue here about changing lifestyles. I mean, in order to deal with some of the issues about carbon that Patrick and Christoph have talked about, it's not just improving building, it's changing how we live. Are we going to eat the same amount of meat? Are we going to fly as often or not? Now, much of what has made London the preeminent city in Europe over the last 20 years has depended on a revolution in food, the influence of other European cuisines to the rather stodgy traditional English fare, and also the ability of people in London to go on weekend breaks to other cities across Europe. Both of those things are threatened not so much by COVID, but by Brexit. And it's going to be interesting to see how those two things intermesh and whether they really do encourage people to change lifestyles or force people to change lifestyles, or whether there will simply be a creative way around them.
Thank you. Well, let me bring in Allison Brooks on this because, Alison, there seems to have been a bit of an assumption this week that in future apartment blocks you will inevitably have a requirement for, if not balconies, then possibly winter gardens, but some sort of access to terraces or courtyards or open space so that if there was any repeat of this ghastly pandemic, people could at least know that they would have access to somewhere where they could do a bit of exercise and indeed get some fresh air and perhaps a view of nature.
Well, I think it would be nice to think that the mentality has shifted so fundamentally across the industry. I'm talking about the client group of the industry in terms of urban residential development. I think it will take. I think there's a lag. There's a lag there in the sense that most of the projects that are being planned or developed at this moment, they're all based on, the previous business model, the project business model, market values, land values, all of those things, space standards. And I think it will take a long time to shake those off because the whole financial equation is based on the previous reality. But I think it will take effect, but it needs, I think, a really fundamental shift, even, far beyond just the notion of just having a balcony or bigger windows. I think we, as a society, need to fundamentally rethink the whole idea of use classes and land use. That the pandemic has shone a light on so many things, including, climate crisis and health issues, inequity, the race issues that are also a kind of bubbling problem in our profession, in the design profession. But I think that there are things that we've refused to see that will fundamentally shift the way we plan our cities and use our buildings. And that, I think, is about the converging of work space and production space with living space. That we still talk, like the fact that we're even talking about residential developments. I don't think there's such a thing as a residential development anymore. I think every residential building is an office building or a place for startups. It's incubator space. It's a really fundamental shift in conceiving of space and how we dwell and how we coexist. And so I think that also needs legislative change. It needs market change. It needs just acknowledgement that cities can actually be more integrated, less segregated. We can be better neighbors. We can create more economically diverse and healthy neighborhoods by just acknowledging what's already going on, but that the industry has been blind to until now.
Thank you very much. Well, I want to turn to Maria Warner-Wong in Singapore, because I always take Singapore to be the kind of experimental ground of urban thinking in many respects. So, Maria, do you recognise the issues that Alison is raising, and what sort of discussion is happening in Singapore about building use and types and kind of hybrid and blended lifestyles?
Well, as you know, Singapore is a highly planned and highly systematically developed and very dense urban environment. But the focus over the past 10 years or so has really been on increasing the per capita access to green space. So we're in a different developmental stage altogether, as are the countries in our region. Singapore is quite a bit more advanced, and almost 85% of the population lives in a relative degree of public housing, which is of a very, very high quality. So in the planning, the access to green open spaces and access to fresh air has been a very high priority. And I think that through COVID, what we've seen with a very high percentage of the population working from home or partially working from home has been that it's put the housing developments to the test. And I think that in a way, COVID has catapulted the conversation forward, wherein the things that we've been, expressing alarm about over the past 20 years suddenly have become mainstream conversation that we feel a very high percentage of the people now understand and grasp. So what is actually going on for us is that we're trying to increase awareness of the importance beyond the embodied energy to the life cycle costing of projects, and to really start thinking about architecture and its integration with landscape in a more regenerative manner. Now, we have the good fortune of living in the tropics where anything grows, and it's an incredibly fertile and lush environment. So we actually do really aspire to having enormous amounts of green space per capita. And we have been developing green corridors, bicycle lanes, huge amounts of public spaces, nature reserves. And what we've seen happening over the past 8 months, Singaporeans used to hang out in shopping malls and spend a lot of time in air-conditioned commercial spaces. But when they couldn't do that, a huge interest in spending time in open spaces has evolved. So now you see nature reserves packed on weekends. People who work from home have time to go out and exercise in the morning in public spaces. So I think it's putting the city to the test, and maybe a lot of the ideas that had been developed and implemented over the past 10 years are now really being appreciated. People really appreciate the importance of having a good place to work or good work environment at home. Although homes by and large are very small, I think that they do have adequate air and views and access to fresh air and areas where you can exercise. So I think that we're doing well. We still have to keep moving forward. And I think that Singapore really does want to be exemplary in what it's achieving. We're working together with Patrick's team here on a project where we're developing a project that's going to be the first hotel to achieve, or that's aiming for, a super low energy like Green Mark Platinum category. It's a completely different and new level that's never been applied to a building in hospitality before. So we're very challenged. It's not easy. We're pushing the limits of the envelope and seeing what can be achieved in our particular tiny environment here.
Thank you very much. I'd like to turn to Joe Noero to ask whether access to nature, access to air, whatever problems the country may be facing at the moment, at a kind of human experience level, is there kind of equal access to these things for all?
There is, Jeremy, but the question that I'd like to answer was one you asked before, if you don't mind, which is, what have been the big changes in South Africa? And I think there have been two, because we've been through a period of great reflection. The first one was that, under apartheid, the whites colonized the black people through the apartheid laws. But since freedom in 1994, all of South Africa, whites and blacks, have now understood what being colonized means, because we are being colonized by other large countries around the world. As an example, one of the most ubiquitous building materials we ever had in our country, I mean, it was used more prolifically than even bricks, was corrugated sheeting. Now we have to import all our corrugated sheeting from China. And it goes on and on and on. So what we are trying to do now is to build up our own inner resilience so that we don't have to be so exposed globally. Now, the way that plays out in terms of architecture is, for example, in a city like Cape Town, where we relied upon an international tourist market, which has collapsed completely, and no longer foreigners who are on our shores. It's caused our leisure industry to look internally to the country and to our borders to neighboring African countries. And what's happened is that there's been a huge burst of activity converting, relatively new modern movement office buildings, 27, 30 stories high, into low-cost hotels and low-cost accommodation. We're doing a number of them. And that's all our work at the moment, is taking buildings and converting them to new uses. But I think what's different from what other people have been talking about is our old buildings are relatively new, in the sense that they're maybe 30, 40 years old. They're not older than that, because our cities are very new, certainly in terms of the tall buildings. So what we have to do in South Africa is we have to bring people into our cities, because they live on the outskirts. And living on the outskirts, the income thresholds are too low, so they really can't sustain themselves there economically. So we're trying to build up our city cores and to create opportunities for people to come and live and work there. So green space is really not an issue, because we've probably got too much of it. I mean, only 15% of our country is urbanized. The rest is all open green space. So we've got plenty of it, but we have lots of work to do in rebuilding and building our cities up so they become coherent and they become equitable. And I think that the pandemic, if I can say the positive side, was that it caused us to wake up with a rude shock and realize that South Africa can't become a service industry, a service economy where we're all waiters or bartenders or whatever it is. We've got to start making work for ourselves that go way beyond that, and we can't any longer rely upon foreign trade in order to support ourselves. So I'm not anti-globalism, but I think what we're doing is we feel that we need to grab back a little bit of what we've lost, because I think we're particularly vulnerable in Africa when it comes to trade with countries outside of Africa. So I think we're probably intellectually we're in a much stronger position than we were 8-9 months ago. We've thought carefully about where we want to go as a country, but we've got to find the wherewithal to achieve it, and that's going to be the hard work, which is going to face us in the next 4 to 5 years.
Joe, thank you very much for that. I want to flip back over to London and invite Simon Allford to make a comment about this balance between nature and open space. London's wonderful parks, its tradition of squares, but what has happened in the last 20, 25 years, which is increasing densification and increasing population. Are we successfully keeping these things in balance, or do we need a bit of a rethink?
It's quite interesting to get the international perspective, just following on your question from what Joe was saying, because I think Jerry mentioned Brexit. It's quite interesting that how we have this short perspective London's been part of Europe long before the EU and will remain part of the world long after the EU. And, Joe's talking about South Africa looking inward to actually generate a better future. And I think there is something going on that is about rethinking the assumed. And the assumed to me is the knowledge of the last 20 years, because we didn't really air condition our buildings 20 years ago. We worried about density, and we continue to worry about density, but actually London depopulated 20 years ago and has been repopulating, and we're only getting back to the population levels we're at now, that we're at 20 years ago. So to me, this whole time is about a consideration of generosity and tolerance. London's actually an incredibly green city. And actually incredibly mixed, city in terms of a rich history of immigration. And so I'm sort of optimistic that we need to build on what we have in a cleverer way. And as Christoph was saying, really, you've just got to think about, when we talk about building, it's about use and reuse and tolerance of different ways of thinking about it. There's a big retrofit campaign going on, which kind of says, if you don't retrofit, it's bad. Well, a lot of the buildings we might be unable to retrofit are those that were built 20 years ago that were too mean, too intolerant of the future. So I think what we're trying to do is make buildings and cities that encourage and enable adaptation to futures we don't yet know by people who are not yet born. And that's the longer perspective we've got. I think we had that perspective, 50, 60, 80, 100 years ago. 2 world wars probably knocked that perspective out of us, and we became a much more sort of dynamic, brave new world. But actually, London is a really well-structured city. They say it's not a planned city. It is a planned city. It's just lots of plans put together over time. And it is quite a tolerant city in terms of people and how those different plans come together. So London's going to be fine. It will learn to trade in a different way. It's always probably been the most tolerant city in the UK. It will need to become more tolerant, and it will need to become more generous. And to me, that's what we're talking about now. When we, as designers, we're talking about how to make buildings and places that are generous and tolerant of uses and ideas that we don't yet know. And for me, actually, the big worries I have looking forward are big data and intolerance. And and I think that we've got to think about how we design for tolerance, but there's political tolerance, and we need to think about that.
Let me bring in Jeremy Melvin at this point, because Jeremy, in the pages of the Times at the moment, there's been a big debate about this subject of tolerance. What is the difference between tolerance and respect? And asking some fairly fundamental questions about why anybody should show respect for something with which they profoundly disagree, or which they may think in their own way is immoral. And this has raised a whole series of questions which I know that you studied in relation to 17th century history.
Well, almost serendipitously, I came across a book earlier this year by a young American but Oxford-based academic called Teresa Bijam, called Mere Civility. And it looks at the evolution of what she calls toleration, particularly religious but also political toleration, that became a necessity in Europe, but particularly in the island of Great Britain in the 17th century, where coming out of the Reformation, which of course had been intolerant on both sides, both the Reformers and the Catholics, and then of course England, Scotland, Ireland were torn apart by political factions in the Civil War in the middle of the 17th century. And then there was the whole issue of how do you put back not just the country, but how do you put back some sort of civility together? And this was at a point where the English colonial adventures were starting. the beginnings of the settlement in what is now the United States. And Bijan draws attention to the founder of the Rhode Island, what's then called a plantation, a man called Roger Williams, who was in some ways the least tolerant person. He was an absolute separatist, that means advocate of the separation between church and state. But he was also one of the first, if not the first, significant European colonist in the Americas to take Native Americans seriously, to learn their languages, to translate works, so that there could be some form of dialogue. Now, what Paul's referring to, the work I was doing, was particularly around the early developer, 17th century, Nicholas Barbon, who was a very close contemporary of the architect Christopher Wren, but also other people involved with this project of putting the polity back together again, notably the philosopher John Locke. And what struck me in this is that London evolved, or London had to deal with several shocks, political, but also, of course, the shock of the Great Fire of 1666, and then how do you reconstruct that? And there was something about the fluid nature of English political life and political system of the time, given that it was in flux anyway, that actually allowed that to take place remarkably successfully. And what Simon says about London being a planned city, it's just a question of different plans overlaid in time, but also rubbing against each other in space, comes from the innovations that Barbon made that were explicitly capitalist. He was, you know, an early economist and a great advocate of what we would now see as free market capitalism. But he was also working at the same time as Christopher Wren, who came from a very different sort of background. Barbon's background was very puritanical. Wren's was, high church, monarchist, for which both his father and his uncle suffered, and of course he benefited from royal patronage. And it struck me that if you look at the plans of Wren's city churches, they are trying to put into practice, in architectural terms, some idea, not just symbolically, but some real resolution of toleration between the Presbyterian tradition and the Episcopalian tradition of Christianity, between the monarchism of the political settlement as it was reimposed in the 1660s, and the Republican parliamentary-led political system that didn't work but was tried to be implemented under Cromwell. And of course, to recognize the enormous liberating capabilities of capitalism, which were underwritten by people like John Locke. So I think there is something very fundamental about how we can think as architects, which I'm not, but architecture can also interface with political thinking.
Well, let me bring back Joe Noero on this, because this question of respect and tolerance, whether it's about architectural ideas or the way we should plan our cities or how we treat different citizens, is a kind of it's a seamless condition. If you can't have respect for a sort of architecture, can you have respect for a group in society? Joe, you've had to grapple with these questions both as a citizen of South Africa, during apartheid and afterwards, but also working as a practicing architect at the same time.
Yeah. Well, I think that it's I can only talk about South Africa because that's the only place that I know and where I've worked. It's a very messy business. You know, we got our freedom 25 years ago. We have an extraordinary constitution. We have a Bill of Rights that is remarkable. We have a whole range of things. And using those frameworks, we're having to learn to work and live together. And it's not easy. It's really difficult. Everything in South Africa is contested. But then I suspect, in a sense, in a form of radical democracy, that's what it's like. Everyone has a voice. And the thing that I think is needed is just time. time for us to be able to begin to understand and negotiate, learn how to negotiate with each other. At the moment in South Africa, we're not doing that very well, because every group feels they have a right to negotiate what they want, regardless of what other people might want. And I find it very exciting. I mean, it could just be that my nature, my temperament is directed towards working in those kinds of environments. So I love working in that kind of way. But I find a hell of a lot of people that I know find it really scary and quite terrifying, and just shy away from it completely. So I suppose you've got to be temperamentally suited to it. And it's also about the historical stage that your country is in at the time where these things start to emerge. I mean, one of the things that I've always been completely knocked out about London, for example, as a city, is how incredibly well integrated it is. I mean, you know, if you read newscasts and you see what's happening in the media, you think, you know, there's lots of problems. People get killed because of skin color or because of gang warfare, whatever. But I think, you know, for me, the large city that best epitomizes that question of tolerance is London. I really mean it. And I think we've got a lot to learn for how you've done it. There are lots of other big cities where we think they have tolerance and they have nothing. I mean, it's just scary to move from one part of the city to the other. So somehow you got it right. And maybe it goes back to the 17th century and it sits in Wren's hands, Jeremy. I don't know. But you did something right, I think.
I want to ask Patrick Bellew about a current controversy which has blown up, involving a couple of the biggest architects around, Foster and Partners and Zaha Hadid Architects. And they have withdrawn from a grouping called Architects Declare, who made some fairly explicit suggestions about how architects should behave in relation to carbon and climate change. And I wonder if you've got a perspective on this, Patrick, and whether actually is it possible for responsible architects to, let's say, design an airport in the 21st century? And if not, why not?
Well, we've all started to spin all over our internal conversations today, because it's something that we're wrestling with as well as a business. Is where do we sit in this very difficult question? I personally think it's a shame that they feel they have to withdraw. And I think it's a shame that we get to a point where we take out of play certain particularly important building typologies being handled by architects of great skill and commitment and dedication. So that may sound a bit like I'm sitting on the fence, but I feel that maybe I'm not. I do feel that there is a need for good architects to be working on these massive buildings. They can make a good building that is, you know, if you're talking about air travel, for example, it isn't going to go away. I think the technology of air travel will improve enormously in the years ahead. It will still be a big carbon emitter, but I think we're never going to stop. It's the realist in me says, even if we're going to reduce the amount of air travel, we will never eliminate it. And therefore, we need efficient hubs and efficient and effective transport interchanges to allow, you know, people to connect between modes of travel and so on. This is not going to change. And I feel we need to be pragmatic and say it's going to happen. And we want our best minds focused on doing the best buildings in that space. I think, as I understand it, they're leaving. Well, I haven't read all of the detail of why they're leaving, but I'm sure it's to do with the sort of the moratorium on aviation. And we've been involved in a few aviation projects recently, and we still are, going back for quite a while. And it's always been an area that's troubled us. You know, we think, you know, what should we be doing? But you know, it used to be the argument you would say that, you know, if we didn't do it, somebody else would do it, and we feel we can do it as well or better. And you might argue, you know, on our well-known project in Singapore, the Gardens by the Bay, did they really need to build 2 big glass houses and 2 big greenhouses? Now, Maria has talked very eloquently about how Singapore, the Singaporeans value those sorts of investments in infrastructure. I think we can apply a similar kind of argument to airports as being something that's about what we do as designers. So doing them as well as we can, I think, is still a valid argument. I think it's one that can be shot down. I would accept that. To say that we should, in a sense, be just refusing to deal with them. But I don't think that in the end will resolve the problem. I think what we need to do is to step up the game in terms of how construction delivers very low carbon to deal with what we can deal with, and expect that the aviation industry is going to, in time, respond. And it already is, but in time it will respond even better to the removal of carbon from flight. It's interesting that in BA and most other airlines shutting down their old 747 fleets. That in a sense, in one step, they've taken away some very inefficient aircraft out of the system, and what's happening now, there are more efficient aircraft coming in. Now, I'm not an exponent of the aviation industry as such, but I do feel that this is definitely an area where we need to be sensible and figure out how we can make sure that the best minds are still focused on these tough problems, and that with their experience.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much. I think it's a very fair-minded attitude, and I'm reminded that Andrew Wally of Grimshaw made an explicit kind of defense of aviation at WAF in Amsterdam, in the sense that he pointed out that at a time when construction, let's say from the middle of the 19th century to today, actually in many ways hasn't moved on very much. I mean, there are still recognizable techniques of manufacture and assembly which would have been perfectly familiar to the 19th century, whereas the aviation industry went from men running about flapping their arms up and down with artificial feathers attached on the end to landing a man on the moon in 1969. And his question was, well, which industry do you think is likely to make the most progress in moving towards environmentally sensible solutions, aviation or construction? I think it's an interesting question. But I want to, I'm going to bring in Christoph Ingenhoven now, if I may, with a different question about a different form of aviation, which is to say drone technology. And I wonder, Christoph, if you'd like to speculate to the extent to which delivery in the future and even personal transport may be more about moving through the air rather than driving cars.
I'm a little frightened about that. I mean, because we tried to establish a drone port in one of our buildings. It was not possible because there are no regulations for that. There's not even an idea how these things really look like and how they work. I think there's a lot of rumors what we will do in the future, and there's a lot of advertisement. I think we're looking forward for another 15 years until these things really work in our daily life, and there might be just another alternative kind of transport, adding as well to our to good things as to bad things. Let me say something to that kind of transportation thing, airports, and because I would say, I mean, we all have experiences with provisional airports, right? And they work pretty well. We had a big fire in Düsseldorf, for example, many years ago, and there were like 10 structures just for making it possible to have an airport. And it was beautiful. The thing was more direct, the thing was more efficient. Everybody liked it. Everybody was like tolerant with some difficulties that appeared. It was nice, and they replaced it by a big modern airport. Why? Yeah, was it really needed? I mean, is a new Berlin airport really needed? Or could we do that also with Tegel and with Tempelhof? I think it would have been possible if you take away all the shopping and if you take away all these things that you don't really need. Yeah, why not? Then you wouldn't need any new airport, I think. I mean, so the architect is responsible for that. I'm sure. You can't say if I'm not doing things, somebody else is doing that. I mean, this is the worst reasoning ever. You know that, the worst reasoning ever. I think we are responsible, and we have to say no sometimes, and we have to. There's one other aspect maybe about transportation. If you look to to the cars and to the planes and the attractiveness of it. Where does it come from? It comes from freedom, right? I mean, cars gave us a kind of freedom we never had before. And would you get rid of cars? I don't think so. Would you get rid of planes? I don't think so. What I think is it's very, very impressive to see when there was the invention of the catalysator, and then there was the diesel scandal, and then there were and a Musk appearing with that electrification of cars. And these kind of events forced the industry to do the very best, right? And the movement was immense. Now, even the normal fuel motors are so much better than before. So I expect the industry under big pressure to be much better. Look at the vaccine industry. Look at the pharmaceutical industry under that pressure. What beautiful and wonderful thing they can do. So what we should agree about is capitalism is a very nice system if you set the right standards. But public and politics have to set these standards and have to be very, very demanding about how we will live in the future. And the industry will make it possible. I'm truly sure that will happen.
Thank you very much. Well, I'd like to bring Simon Allford back in on this because, Simon, your suggestion, which I think is historically absolutely valid, which London has indeed been a planned city. It's just that it isn't one plan. It's many plans through time and space. And I wonder whether you envisage at the moment an ongoing trend towards the reduction, major reduction certainly, of cars, and in particular in central London, and what you think the implications might be for urban design.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, I mean, I just thought I'd just briefly talk a little bit about that in terms of carbon and this debate, because to me it's an example of intolerance. And the danger of the debate, the way it's going, is people are not prepared to listen or actually fully dig into views that aren't similar to theirs. So I don't design airports because I've not been asked to. And I don't like shopping centres either. I don't design them because I've not been asked to. I don't think either are particularly interesting building types to me. However, I have and will continue to fly on planes. I also noticed that you use more carbon driving a car solo than going by plane. So this attack on airports is naive. And you could equally, the people who are criticizing airports are using Amazon, which is using a huge amount of carbon, moving goods around in cardboard that's 10 times the quantity of the material involved. So there's intolerance, and that's a real issue. And we're not going to get into a smarter world unless we think really openly about carbon as the challenge and how we manage carbon while allowing people to continue to live their lives. And I think, in London, I don't use a car. I do own one, but I use public transport because I can. And I use my car to go somewhere else relatively full with my family because I can't get there by train. So I think in the UK, infrastructure is absolutely crucial. If we want to liberate the road from the car, we've got to improve our transport system. And that doesn't include very large empty buses moving around at inappropriate times. So again, let's not ban cars and ban planes, particularly as I don't know anyone who's banned flying from their own holiday life. Let's start saying, how do we make a low carbon city work better? To me, we start looking at smart ways of moving people around through better infrastructure, and we think about better designed public space. We think about cleaner air and the benefits of that. And we start talking about it as, how do we benefit the human condition without, exceeding, what Christoph was saying, a sensible carbon budget. So diverting it into an intolerant hatred of planes or airports or cars is not the issue. The real issue is, how do we enhance the human condition designing in a lower carbon way? And then we'll have a proper discussion, and there'll be differences of opinions, and we can allow the best ideas to emerge. But let's not shut down things through an intolerant and actually quite stupid, pig-headed attitude.
Thank you very much. I'd like to go to Maria Warner-Wong to discuss this, because Singapore cars are extremely expensive to buy. Taxis are used really as a significant part of the public transport system, but of course there is public transport also. Maria, are Singaporean attitudes to cars changing at all, or is there still an aspiration that, you know, if you've made it, you can buy one?
I think that the younger generation no longer feel that a car and car ownership is a measure of success and achievement the way previous generations did, because they value leisure activities, the outdoors, sports, and other things that they do. I think there's just a lot more for them to do now that there's a lot more open public space, and there are a lot more bike lanes and bicycle dedicated areas. So I think that the demand for automobiles is actually going to diminish. And I wanted to add on aviation that this is a country of 5 million people that has built 5 international airports in 50 years. So we literally have added an additional international air terminal every decade that this country has been a country. I don't think that we would be able to survive without air travel. The air travel growth is our future, because we're disconnected from the world, and the only way we can connect with the world is through aviation. So I think that it's very utilitarian, it's a necessity, and I don't think it's going to be diminishing here. But having said that, I think 5 airports is a lot, and I think that that's going to be enough perhaps for the next 15 to 20 years, if I'm not mistaken. But I think that people also have very different ambitions. That now that the country is sort of reaching a point of development, a plateau of development, the younger generation's values are shifting as well. I think that the way that people were ambitious in the past is really, the next generation has very, very different values. So I think we're going to see a shift toward much more diverse land use, a lot more recreational land use, and I don't think the country is going to devote more space to automobiles in their future master plans.
Thank you very much, Maria. And I must say, here in London, young people, many of them can't afford a car anyway, but do you know what? Even if they could, they're not interested. They just don't want them. They can use public transport to get around the capital with ease. Let me bring Allison Brooks in on this. Allison.
Well, I totally agree that the value system, I think, is quite different of younger generations than the current one, and I think it will be even more perhaps activist or more focused after the pandemic, after this time, because it's actually brought to everybody's attention so many things that we weren't really aware of or paying attention to. And one of the things that the conversation about urban transport brings to mind is the issue of acoustics. And I think noise and the lack of noise, the reduction in noise when there was lockdown, at least in London, was a kind of incredible thing that everybody experienced, the sort of joy of silence, of kind of peace in an urban situation, and being able to hear birds and hear nature or just hear silence was kind of unbelievably soothing somehow. And so I think, and then we equally, we have problems with our acoustics in terms of our conversations and business situations now with video conferencing and the environments in which we work, which aren't very good acoustically. And so I think the, acoustics is a pretty broad topic, but I think it's part of the equation of sort of recalibrating how we operate, how, the environments in which we work, and how the conventions with which we've worked, lots of hard surfaces, lots of reflective surfaces, and transparency and glass, and travel and commuting, and there's a lot of sort of violence, like acoustic violence and environmental violence, that you can actually see a way out of by this massive shift, this massive behavioral shift that's happened as a result of the pandemic. And I think, like, on a really optimistic note, I think the most, perhaps for the profession and for this conversation we're having, I think it's, as a result of the pandemic, it's maybe the first time the architectural profession is having literally the same conversation as practically everybody else in the world. Everybody's had a kind of common cause, a common threat, a common challenge. We all have a shared experience now with people in every corner of the earth, and every corner of the earth has faced this sort of awakening and paying attention to these things which are not working, and which are unhealthy, and which are restrictive and limiting. And so I think we need to really capitalize on this moment where we are having the same conversations as everybody else, and we share the threats, we share the challenges, and we're trying to embrace the solutions in a much more holistic way, which means bringing also clients and the industry as a whole into this conversation. These crises, we share all these crises. It's not exclusive to architects and our profession.
Thank you very much indeed. Actually, I think that the question about rethinking things and opportunities, we heard yesterday on our question time panel from Francis Anderton from Los Angeles. We were asking a question about what had happened to traffic on the freeways, and was the commuter journey coming to an end in that city. And she said what had happened was there was a big reduction in car traffic, but the consequence was that instead of people crawling along at 8 miles an hour, as they usually do, people could travel much more quickly. People were going out and traveling for America really quite fast. And the consequence has been a huge increase in the number of accidents. One shouldn't laugh at that, but I don't think we could quite help ourselves, because, that idea of the freeway actually becoming a freeway and people doing whatever they like hasn't had entirely happy consequences. But just again, picking up this point about architecture based on health and amenity and well-being and time to rethink what our values are. I mean, Jeremy, this sounds kind of familiar from various times in architectural history, both, at the start of modernism, but then perhaps more recently in the 1960s. We've had a comment come in saying that, anything goes in the 1960s, a time of great freedom and great toleration and great respect in many respects. And there was the question at the end of this was, is this concern with health and well-being and tolerance going to lead to greater tolerance in architectural discussion? Or, as we've heard in the great debate about airports, might there be more partisanship?
I think it's a very interesting point to raise, because the more one thinks about things in silos, health, education, even architecture and politics, the more people will self-identify or self-define. And that is not necessarily an absolute obstacle to tolerance, but it is a barrier to it. And I think that the rethinking needs to be at a much more fundamental level. And we've got to lose these labels that we give ourselves and that we get given by other people, because it's convenient taxonomy rather than anything really fundamental. And we need to think, yes, of course, health is an underlying issue that affects everyone, potentially affects everyone. Everyone has a state of health and it can be improved or it can be made worse. But I think that if we try to think in silos of 19th century thought, basically, we'll be finished. What we've got to do is try and rethink the fundamentals, and then possibly to create new silos of thought that may themselves be life limited as well.
Well, this is a very interesting point that picks up on a talk we had yesterday from Lars Kruckerberg from Graft Architects, who was talking about identity. I mean, architectural identity, but also cultural identity, and how those things can mesh. And I wonder if I could ask Joe Noero to comment on this, because of all the societies in the world, identity at the transfer from apartheid to the modern South African state was one where questions of identity were writ extremely large. I wonder if you have any observations, John, on how social and cultural identity feeds into and may be aided or made more problematic by architectural design.
Well, I think, again, I think South Africa is unique in comparison with the rest of Africa, but we've somehow managed to find a way of dealing with this idea of trying to create an African architecture, which always scares the hell out of me because there are 47 countries in Africa, so I really don't know what that means. But I think that the thing that is very important in our country is to give a voice to the people who didn't have voices before, and I think it's happening around the world. So, the movements that have emerged during this period of the pandemic, and we need many more Black women and other people in our profession to give expression to the kind of communities that they know well, the kind of issues that they feel are important to them. In South Africa, unfortunately, the architectural profession is probably the least transformed of all the professions. It really, it's still 90% white. And, so it's a very poor example to look at. But I think we're moving somewhere towards resolving that. But what I don't want to do is I don't want to get caught up in this kind of good, woke kind of culture, which is that you've got to be Black in order to be able to design architecture for Black people, or it's only Black people that have the right to speak about Black issues. I think it's that question of tolerance you were speaking about, but to create the space for a variety of different voices to be heard and to be realized. And I think that's very difficult. I mean, we're nowhere near achieving that in our country, and I don't think we're doing it anywhere else in the rest of the world. It's obviously much easier in countries where you have monolithic cultures, but in South Africa we don't, and I think we'd be a good test case to look at in the future. But Paul, I wanted to say one thing. I'm sorry I'm changing the subject, because you spoke about the building construction and you spoke about airline technology. And I want to, when Jeremy was talking about fundamental principles, I was drawn back to the 70s and 80s when people were talking about convivial modes of production, of saying that there are scales at which certain things are better produced at, say, a small scale than they are at a big scale. And I actually think that architecture is much better produced using localized systems of production, rather than the sort of, Norman Foster Big Bang theory of bringing 120 countries involved in the production of components, flying them in and sticking them all together in one building. And it's in fact the way in which the vast majority of buildings in the world today are being built, and they will continue to be built. And I think we've got to understand that there are scales at which things are best produced, and we don't talk about that anymore. And our drive for efficiency, to produce something quicker and faster than anyone else, we lose all of that, and it gets smoothed out, and we get into all the kind of trouble we're facing now, climate change, producing, buildings that don't work, etc., etc. So I think a revisit to the 70s and 80s might do everyone a lot of good. They could look at Schumacher, and they could look at John Turner, and they could look at a whole bunch of others. I think there'd be some good lessons there.
Thank you very much.
So I had to say it because you offered that challenge when you mentioned your comparison.
Absolutely. We've had an interesting question has come into us, which is saying could the panelists, with the exception of Jeremy, because it's unfair because he doesn't design buildings, but would each of the panelists like to comment on whether the results of the pandemic and its possible results have meant that you've changed the design of a building that you're currently processing? Let's go back to London. Start with you, Simon Allford, because you've got a lot of work on. Is there any rethinks in respect of either spatial strategies or materials or products?
Yes, undoubtedly. I think the pandemic, it's just triggered better thinking on everything. So we were already designing buildings that offered something back to the city in terms of public space and public rooms. We were already designing buildings that had good light, good volume, good air, generous circulation systems, less reliance on the lifts, things that Benedetta was talking about, green roof. We've taken what plant we have, mechanical plant, off the roof and put it into the basements. And then we've created, green gardens on the roof in all forms, educational, commercial, residential buildings. But it's all stuff we were doing. The benefit goes back to what everyone said, the pandemic has sort of given a little bit of time of reflection, and suddenly the idea that buildings are transitory has fallen away. And there's a new idea that buildings are long-term assets, and in that sense need to have a real social and cultural value as well as an economical value. So we're making much smarter buildings, but it's accelerated good practice. As Patrick said, to do that, we've got to really get into how we make them. So Joe's point about supply chains, how do we move materials? How do we make buildings now? Do we make them differently? Yes, we should maybe get away from curtain walling and look at making the frame of the building also the architecture. Make windows part of an infill. We don't need to import products from greater differences. All these things allow us to make a low energy building, but a low embodied carbon building. So it's a terrible time on many levels, but I hope a lot of really good thought about what architecture is, what it might feel like, look like, smell like, and how you will make it is coming forward. And the client on the project Patrick and I are working on got a bit intolerant himself at times and was kind of complaining that we're a bit slow. And I said, it's not easy. We're on a journey. We're on a discovery. And if you want innovation, it's not immediate either. If you want us to make things in a different way, we need a bit of time to find out. Rather than the image of difference, the reality of difference, that requires thought, time, and adequate fees.
Thank you very much. And just one supplementary to that. Can I ask you whether the world of touch-free and sensor technology is part of a trend you see accelerating?
Yeah, but again, it's we've always had this thing, if you can't see something, you won't use it. We shouldn't have doors. Doors should be opened and closed in the event of fire. So while something like fire safety is incredibly at the forefront of all our minds, particularly in a post-Grenfell world, it's all been happening. But I don't want buildings to disappear into a world of excess technology. So there is an idea that fresh air will only be blown to where people are. But my point is, don't blow it in the first place. Rely on a window. So in my world, we're talking about caves rather than oil rigs. Buildings made of sensible volumes and thermally massive materials with low carbon, and that's a challenge, rather than oil rigs full of pipes solving the world's problems with technology. It's go back to a kind of very good model that served us pretty well for about 2,000 years. Basic building physics.
Thank you very much. Patrick Bellew, would you like to pick that one up? I wouldn't necessarily expect that you'd be doing anything different, but it may be speeding. Well, you may be getting more acceptance from more people.
It's interesting, Paul. It's like you've read my script. That's what I was about to say. I mean, the thing is that some of the things we've been talking about for years and years, about putting air in from the floor so that you have the air that you're getting at desks is fresher, it's not been recirculated. That's definitely changed. With the push behind that has definitely been has changed thanks to COVID. There's a story about one of the groups in America that worked through the pandemic was the national labs in various places around the world. Berkeley, everyone's standard. They had these national research laboratories, and they were all there working away. And there was a lady had a desk fan on her desk, and she was her air conditioning probably wasn't working so well, and she sat there with her fan going. And she then got the COVID symptoms, and she shared it with 7 other people who were sitting in the downdraft, the backdraft of the fan. So she was actually blowing her germs across a group of colleagues in the same office, and they all went down with COVID. This is in one of the national research laboratories looking at things against COVID. But that's the same sort of thing we get in most of our buildings when you have air conditioning overhead and you blow cold air around and blow air around. Something we've always tried to push against, because you're sitting always in stale, dirty, mixed air. Whereas if you blow the air from the floor, it's not only more energy efficient, it's actually the age of the air and the freshness of the air is much better. And so we're certainly seeing nearly all of our clients are jumping back to that. Whereas our clients, working things like WWF years ago that had underfloor air, lots of our projects had underfloor air because it seems to be the right thing to do in terms of energy. And we're now finding massive pickup on that in the London office market, which was very resistant to it before. So that's definitely a COVID and energy win, if you like, if one doesn't really be scoring things that way, but that's definitely been our experience.
Thank you very much. Let's move on to Christoph. Any changes to any of your current projects?
Yeah, I think we have to say that the green issues and the energy issues have been there before, and they will develop and evolve. But there are some more specific things about the pandemic, because I'll give you an example. I mean, we will raise the sanity and the hygienical standards of our buildings, right? You could have like door handles and things that are better than others. You could make sure that the people can use toilets and washrooms in a different way. You have to provide more space in the wider corridors. You have to look at like more outside spaces. Germany is not as privileged as San Francisco or South Africa, so we have to take care for outside spaces to be comfortable, rain protected, and maybe like winter gardens and things. So we were always very interested in natural ventilation. I think natural ventilation, operable windows are essential. Everyone wants to have that now. So the very practical things that we have to change, and we already are working on that in the buildings that we are actually planning. And filters, for example, is a very important thing. If you put certain filters, think about schools and kindergartens and places like that, you have to provide very, very efficient filtering. We talked about planes. A plane in itself, in the cabin, is not a very dangerous thing, because you have a very, very efficient filtered air and a special airflow. So we could learn from each other how we could do that, how we could provide the best filtered and best quality air, not just air conditioned, but also like natural ventilated, things like that.
That's great. Thank you very much.
I'm still talking.
Coffee.
Allison
Can
Brooks?
somebody try to tell her that she's muted, maybe?
Thanks, Paul. I think we will probably be able to change some of the projects that we're working on as they move into the next stage. We have quite a few projects that are in between stage 2 and stage 3, or stage 3 and stage 4. And so there will be opportunities to renew conversations with clients and argue for things like more space, more generous corridors or lifts. We've been arguing for high ceilings for very many years, and this principle of generosity being embedded into every project so that it therefore is adaptable and therefore has longevity. This, a lot of these things that I think a lot of architects have been arguing for many, many years are now being taken much more seriously. So I think in a way it's going to be, our values, architectural values, tied with values around sustainability and low carbon and loose fit and long use. They will have much more strength now. We will have more agency, and so I think
That's great.
That's a really helpful, position to be in.
Thank you. Great. Maria Wong.
Yes. Okay, I'm not muted. Okay, so, we had SARS here at the beginning of this century, and in Hong Kong it happened as well. And for the subsequent 5 to 8 years, we saw massive transformation in the building code and regulations, and also in the industry, the products, touchless products that were available. So, we had such a tremendous scare at that time that it really forced us into action. But the action didn't happen overnight. It took time for product development to occur, for policies to change, for things to be tested and approved. But by 2008, I would say that ours was by and large a touchless built environment. So a lot of that, I think, will come in the next 5 years on a worldwide level because of this pandemic. We don't have buildings that are changing right now per se as a result of the pandemic because, again, the codes are already there for the safe environment, for the touchless access and so forth. And the other thing is that I'm not sure if you're aware that in Singapore, the entire hotel industry has been converted into quarantine facilities. So they've used it as a distancing tool, whether it's for construction workers who used to live in dorms or for people returning, residents and citizens returning from overseas who have to be quarantined for 14 days. So they've activated a lot of the real estate and actually made it possible to keep it in use, which I think that flexibility has been a very good thing.
Well, thank you very much. And apologies, Joe, but we've run out of time here in London. Can I thank all of the participants, including Benedetta, who is chatting away there, but I fear on mute, for your time this afternoon. I think nearly 2 hours has gone incredibly quickly. We've covered a huge variety of ground. And from your many different perspectives, I thought there was a remarkable degree of unanimity, at least on many of the subjects discussed. So thank you for your time at WAFVirtual, and we hope to see you all in Lisbon next year. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye, Rob.
Bye-bye.
Good to see you all. Bye.